I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled, U.S. Still Dangerous Despite Limits of Military Production. And this is a continuing theme that I've been covering throughout the duration of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, beginning in 2022, continuing until today. I've been talking about Western military industrial production and its inability to keep up with the collective West's geopolitical ambitions. We're talking about the encirclement and containment of all peer and near-peer competitors. This is a decades-spanning geopolitical objective. They're talking about, obviously, the Russian Federation, Iran in the Middle East, all of its allies and partners there, and of course China in the Asia-Pacific region and all of its partners and allies. So as usual, I'm going to read through this article that I wrote. I will add additional information when and if necessary, and I will show you all of the sources that I cited while writing this article. So let's begin. The U.S. has recently paused the shipment of some weapons and munitions to Ukraine due to worries that U.S. weapons stockpiles have fallen too low, Politico reported. And that is this article right here. Since writing this article and since Politico published this article that I cited while writing this NEO article, the U.S. has said they have resumed shipment of some of these weapons, and other weapon systems continue to flow to Ukraine. And this is something that has actually been starting and stopping since all of this began in 2022. The U.S. has faced weapon shortages throughout the entire duration of this conflict in Ukraine. And as a matter of fact, as I point out in the article, the U.S. actually faced critical weapon shortages even before the conflict began. This is only the most recent development amid a growing military-industrial crisis unfolding across the collective West, as Washington and its network of client states wage increasingly intense and protracted wars and proxy wars, including in Ukraine against Russia, across the Middle East against Iran and its allies, and as the U.S. prepares for similar conflicts in the Asia-Pacific region against China. Politico would note air defense systems, other precision-guided weapons, that usually refers to missiles, maybe glide bombs, things like that, and even artillery shells were among the shipments being paused due to concerns regarding depleted U.S. stockpiles. This should surprise nobody. This has been reported on by the Western media itself, by analysts like myself for the last 3+ years. Alex and Alexander of the Duran, Mark Soboda has been talking about this, Scott of Calibrated has been talking about this for years now. This should surprise nobody. And the underlying causes of this problem have not been addressed. And as a matter of fact, over a year ago, February 2024, I published this video, The Fatal Flaw Undermining America's Defense Industrial Base. And I talked about the National Defense Industrial Strategy. This was a whole report that was put out talking about why the U.S. is incapable of manufacturing as many weapons and as much ammunition as just Russia alone, despite spending more on military matters than the next 10 nations combined. Why is that? And as I've explained many times over, it's because the U.S. uses private corporations to manufacture weapons and ammunition. And these corporations do this purely for profit, not purpose. Their purpose is profit. And so if you're asking them to invest in human resources, to invest in excess industrial capacity that they're not currently using, if you ask them to vertically integrate all of these processes, they will tell you no, because it's inefficient and it undercuts their profits, which is why most nations nationalize the production of military equipment, weapons and ammunition. Russia has nationalized it. China has nationalized it. They have state-owned enterprises that oversee all of this, and they produce the amount of weapons and ammunition the state needs, regardless of whether it is profitable or not. And usually it is profitable, but not as profitable as it could be under a private corporate structure like you see in the US, where these corporations are dictating policy to the government rather than the other way around. Since the beginning of Russia's special military operation in February 2022, initial surges of US, European weapons and munitions have steadily decreased despite promises to expand military-industrial production across the collective West. In some cases, US weapons already faced critical shortages even before the conflict in Ukraine expanded in 2022. Because you have to remember, the conflict was actually going on since 2014 when the US overthrew the government of Ukraine. I refer to this Al Jazeera article. This is just one of many. This was from January 2022, so a month before Russia launched its special military operation. Saudi Arabia may run out of interceptor missiles in months. And of course, in the picture is the US-made Patriot missile system. And they ran out of interceptors. They were using them as part of their war with neighboring Yemen. This was a US-backed proxy war, essentially fought through the Saudis. And Ansar Allah in Yemen possesses ballistic missiles and drones that they were using to target military and industrial targets inside Saudi Arabia, mainly oil infrastructure. And Saudi Arabia was using Patriot missiles to try to intercept them. Not only were they ineffective at intercepting these incoming missiles and drones, they also simply just ran out of interceptors even to try to intercept these incoming targets. And because production is just in time at Lockheed Martin, they did not have additional missiles they could supply. They had no additional industrial capacity to ramp up production to replace these missiles. Saudi Arabia had to borrow missiles from neighboring countries that also operate US-made Patriot missile systems to replenish their stockpiles. So even before the special military operation began the next month, and a sharp increase in the demand for Patriot missiles was established, there was a shortage. Let's continue. So in January 2022, Saudi Arabia announced critical shortages of Patriot air defense interceptors, exhausting them amid its US-backed war with neighboring Yemen. The US, even at that point, was unable to replace Saudi Arabia's depleted stockpiles, forcing Riyadh to borrow missiles from other Persian Gulf states operating the systems. Lockheed Martin. Okay, Lockheed Martin. This is their official website. This is from March 2025, so this year. They're talking about record production. So they're talking about in 2024, they reached 500 interceptors. Then they state down here, by 2027, they should be able to increase all of this by 600, and they should be able to reach 650 interceptors a year. 650 interceptors. That means nothing if you have no point of reference. How many missiles does, let's say, Russia have to fire at targets in just Ukraine alone? And as I've covered many times in the past, Russia has fired thousands and thousands of missiles, meaning they're firing many more missiles into Ukraine than Lockheed Martin is producing total worldwide Patriot missile interceptors to try to shoot them down. As a matter of fact, we have this article from Kiev Independent. Russia's ballistic missile production up at least 66% over the past year, according to Ukrainian intel figures. So this isn't Russian sources, this isn't Russian media, this is US-backed Ukrainian military intelligence talking about 60 to 70 Iskander ballistic missiles alone every single month. Every single month. 10 to 15 hypersonic Kinjals per month. So let's talk about that. Lockheed Martin, which produces Patriot missiles, I just showed you the website, does so at a rate of around 500 to 600 interceptors a year, with plans to expand production to only 650 by the year 2027. So that's not next year, it's the year after that. And that's if everything goes according to plan. Ukraine's requirements alone far exceed this quantity, with Russia producing between, so we saw how many a month that is, what is that per year? 720 to 840 Iskander ballistic missiles. Just Iskander ballistic missiles. We're not even talking about Kinjal or cruise missiles or anything else that Ukraine would need Patriot missiles to try to intercept. According to Ukraine's military intelligence agency, and the Iskander can only be shot down by Patriot missile systems. In theory, I would probably guess that they are able to intercept ballistic missiles, but not as consistently as some might claim, but not as inconsistently as others might claim. Each incoming ballistic missile requires at a minimum 2 Patriot missiles to increase the probability of successful intercept. And if you watch videos of US Patriot missile systems in Ukraine trying to intercept Iskander or Kinjal missiles, you will watch them just empty the entire launcher and any nearby launcher. They just empty out trying to intercept these incoming missiles. They fire everything they have, many more than just 2 per incoming missile. And sometimes then they still miss. So each incoming ballistic missile requires at least 2 Patriot missile interceptors to be fired. And this is just a general rule for all air defense systems. You launch at least 2 interceptors at any incoming target to increase the probability of a successful intercept. That means that even by 2027, Lockheed Martin will only be producing about half the missiles Ukraine would require just to intercept Russian Iskander missiles each year. And that's if every single missile Lockheed made was sent to Ukraine, which they won't be, and they never will be. Only a fraction of what Lockheed Martin produces is going to go to Ukraine, because as we saw in the Middle East, the US required Patriot missiles, also THAAD missiles and other air defense missiles fired by US naval vessels, and air-to-air missiles used by US warplanes, and of course all of the missiles the US produces and hands over to Israel for its air and missile defense systems. They need that for that theater as well. And of course, if war were ever to break out with China, China has the largest missile arsenal on planet Earth in human history. You will obviously need many times more missiles than even the Ukraine conflict and this ongoing war with Iran combined. You would need many times more interceptors. They simply don't exist, and they most likely will never exist. Similar shortages and failures to sufficiently expand production are faced by US Stinger man-portable air defense systems, also referred to as manpads, Javelin anti-tank missiles, counter-battery radar systems, which you don't hear a lot about, but I was tracking shipments of counter-battery radar systems to Ukraine throughout the last 3 years. When the Pentagon would announce weapon shipments, that would be an item in there. And I looked it up, and it takes half a year to a year to just make one of these. But it does not take half a year to a year for Russia to find and destroy them on the battlefield. So these are things that the US simply cannot make faster than they're being lost or expended in Ukraine. Regarding artillery shells, despite benefiting from a rare exception where US government-owned facilities were used to expand shell production regardless of insufficient signal demands and poor business cases, and a head start of several years before the 2022 SMO began, production has only been expanded to about 75,000 shells a month, with the target of 100,000 shells per month expected to be reached by the end of this year. Together with European shell production, Western media still reports Russia enjoys a 3-to-1 advantage in artillery shell production. The US Army made an exception for artillery shell production. They said this is so important, we cannot depend on private industry to make sufficient numbers of these. These are things that you have to make in huge numbers, and you have to keep them on hand, even if you don't sell them, or you have to keep excess industrial capacity available and on hand in case you have to ramp up production, and no private company is willing to do this. So we will own these facilities, and we will operate them at a loss to make sure we have the artillery shells necessary for future conflicts. So they began doing that before Russia began its special military operation in 2022. And despite having that head start, and despite making the exception for this and using state-owned enterprise to do this, or government subcontracting, private contractors, something like that, they're still not able to sufficiently ramp up production, because production is more than just building a factory. You need trained manpower, you need inputs. And again, this was something the US did to save money, to maximize profit. They outsourced everything, even matters of national security. They outsourced it, and now they're trying to vertically integrate it again. And it will take years and years. And even as they do this, it'll always be playing catch up with just Russian production alone, saying nothing of Chinese military industrial production. The production of other more sophisticated military systems is lagging even further behind Russian military industrial output, as is the case with Patriot missiles. Even if the US and Europe could produce comparable quantities of these weapons and munitions, it is impractical to send it all to Ukraine. So even if they were able to match Russia same amount of missiles, same amount of interceptors, same amount of shells. Can the US and Europe afford to send all of this just to Ukraine? The answer is no, because the US and its proxies, its various client states around the globe are not just fighting one war against Russia and Ukraine. They are fighting a multitude of conflicts all around the globe, proxy wars and outright wars. As per stated US foreign policy objectives, and what are these objectives? We know that the US is not just fighting this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. If you go back to US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's directive delivered to Europe in February of this year, he tells Europe, you need to take over this war in Ukraine. We need to try to freeze it, and Europe needs to spend more, not 2%, but 5% of their GDP on buying weapons and producing weapons so that you can at least freeze or slow down or perpetuate the conflict in Ukraine while we pivot to China in the Pacific. That is where the US needs to focus its attention. And before it pivots fully to China, as myself and many other analysts warned, the US would attempt to destabilize and possibly even topple Iran, and to further isolate both Russia and China, and to better America's position ahead of a more concentrated effort against China itself. And in this directive, Secretary Hegseth literally referred to it as the establishment of a division of labor that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and Pacific, respectively. So it is a multi-front war the US seeks to fight, which is why no matter how many weapons and how much ammunition it produces, it cannot afford to send it all just to Ukraine. This is the problem the US has created for itself with its belligerent, unsustainable foreign policy. So as per stated, US foreign policy objectives, that is Secretary Hegseth saying this in public. I have gone over policy papers spanning many years saying the exact same thing, spanning many presidencies. It is not just the Trump administration, it was the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, the Obama administration, the administration of Bush Jr. They were all pursuing the exact same policy objectives, and they were picking up where the last one left off, even if they pretended during campaign season to represent the exact opposite of one another. The US requires large amounts of military equipment, including Patriot missiles, for its continued wars and proxy wars far beyond just Ukraine, including in the Middle East against Iran, where huge quantities of air defense missiles were likewise exhausted in just 12 days of recent fighting, and amid its military buildup across the Asia-Pacific region vis-a-vis China. The US is relying on several strategies to match the reality of limited means of military-industrial production with Washington's desire for unlimited war worldwide, including what US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth referred to as a division of labor, through which the US is forcing its client states to divert public money from actual public interest toward weapons procurements and production in service of Washington's wars and proxy wars worldwide. But of course, they're diverting this public money away from the actual interests of the European people to America's wars and proxy wars around the globe at Europe's expense. For Washington, but at Europe's expense. NATO's recent announcement of bloc-wide spending increases of up to 5% of each member state's GDP was in direct response to Secretary Hegseth's directive delivered in February of this year that I just showed you, that I have been talking about for months, that a lot of people tried to sidestep or dismiss. Now we can see that directive given in February, and now Europe complying to it, despite all the theater and theatrics in between to try to convince you that something otherwise was going to happen. Well, no, that is exactly what happened. The US ordered them to spend 5% of their GDP on buying weapons and producing weapons, and that is what they're going to start diverting public money towards. And people will say, no, well, they're not going to do that because they'll destroy their economy. That is the whole purpose of having proxies. You get them to pay the cost for your policies. They're doing it for you at their expense. That is the whole point. That is what Ukraine was politically captured to do, to fight Russia at Ukraine's expense, not at America's expense. And now Europe is going to start paying a heavier cost for this continued conflict so that the US can continue benefiting, but again, at someone else's expense. Another strategy is often referred to as strategic sequencing, in which the US concentrates available resources on one designated adversary at a time rather than attempting to fight multiple nations at once, and simply because it is impossible to do so. You have to try to tangle up all of your adversaries, fight each one in turn, defeat them in detail rather than try to fight them all at the same time, and allow them to cooperate and assist each other while doing so. And so this is all based on the Marathon Initiative. It's just another one of these corporate financier-funded think tanks. This was published in 2024, Strategic Sequencing Revisited. It's by Wes Mitchell. It says the United States faces a growing risk of a multi-front war against Russia, China, and Iran. The optimal response to this danger would be a sequential strategy aimed at inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia and Ukraine on a faster timeline than China is prepared to move against Taiwan. Please remember that Taiwan is an island province of China. It is recognized under international law as so. It is even recognized by the US State Department under America's own One China policy as such, even though the US in practice treats it as if it is a separate entity that China is somehow bullying. But for that strategy to work, the US must use the current window wisely to shore up the situation in Eastern Europe, broker a more effective division of labor with allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and reform the US defense industrial base. So if you thought Secretary Hegseth was so clever to come up with the concept of division of labor, no, he was just reading a piece of paper someone handed to him, someone like Wes Mitchell from one of these corporate funded think tanks, which actually devises US foreign and domestic policy. Certainly not people that the American people think they elected into office. Elsewhere in this paper, they explain the idea of strategic sequencing even further. It says the idea of sequencing is simply to concentrate resources against one opponent in order to weaken its disruptive energies before turning to another, either to deter or defeat it. Sequencing is necessary because power is not infinite. For even the strongest of states, it is bounded by all kinds of things: distance, money, attention span. So they're talking about the US. It is fighting these wars literally on the other side of the planet from where the US is located on a map. And so that costs you extra to do that. By dealing decisively with one opponent before other threats have fully manifested, a great power seeks to avoid a situation where either its military resources are stretched too thin and it suffers catastrophic defeat, or it has to shoulder the financial burdens of ramping up for a sustained war against all enemies in all directions concurrently, with concomitant restraints on its economic base and society. The goal is to gain an advantage in competition by manipulating the factor of time. So what the US is saying is there is the emerging multipolar world, and when the multipolar world fully rises, it'll be too strong for the US to take on all at once. So what it is trying to do is tangle up Russia in Ukraine, dismember Iran and its network of allies in the Middle East, and then have all of its power available to try to encircle and contain China. Strategic sequencing. And maybe if things are taking too long in Ukraine against Russia, they will speed it up somewhere else. They'll try to put a pin in that and speed up their operation against Iran, or maybe they will start provoking some sort of conflict with China sooner rather than later, fearing that all of these powers, once they have risen, if the US is unsuccessful in disrupting their rise, they will start working together in a way the US will be incapable of countering. And again, countering for what purpose? To maintain American primacy over the planet, to continue exploiting the planet at everyone else's expense for the benefit of a handful of people in Washington and, of course, on Wall Street, whereas the multipolar world seeks a balance of power across nations and the ability for nations to work together rather than one nation subordinating all other nations, those nations working for that nation at their own expense. So that's the key difference between US-led unipolarism and multipolarism, and that is why the US seeks to combat it. So it's not even a really justified reason. And even for the American people themselves, the American people will also be first to pay the cost for all of this before the people actually benefiting from this policy ever pay any cost at all for it. Thus, victory in Ukraine by defeating Russian forces is not necessarily Washington's objective, but rather overextending Russia militarily, economically, and politically by entangling it in a costly and protracted conflict, increasingly fueled by European military support, freeing up US resources to be concentrated on Iran and ultimately China. So a lot of people think the US is in Ukraine to defeat Russia, and I'm saying that that's not necessarily true. There's an entire policy paper by Rand Corporation, published all the way back in 2019, extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. And if you go to this document and you go to the table of contents, it specifically talks about, under geopolitical measures, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. And I've gone over this many times. They talk about provoking a war between Russia and Ukraine to entangle Russia and to overextend it. But they realized by doing so, you would be destroying Ukraine. So there was never even the slightest hint of a possibility that Ukraine would win over Russia. No, the goal is to tangle up Russia and to bleed it as much as possible while fighting them to the very last Ukrainian. That is the goal in Ukraine. Ukraine is being sacrificed in its entirety toward that purpose. And we can't really say that it isn't working, even though the US is faced with all these limitations, and it probably is not doing as well as it had hoped. Look at the other options in the table of contents. Increase support to the Syrian rebels. Because they did measure 1 so successfully, Russia was unable to counter this surge in support for Syrian, I would call them terrorists and mercenaries, and the Syrian government ultimately collapsed because Russia was overextended. Iran was overextended by this policy of division of labor and strategic sequencing. The US is using it. They're having failure, but we also should not make the mistake of denying its success and its continued danger. This is what the whole article is essentially about. Because Russia is committed to its military operations in Ukraine, it is unable to commit significant resources to counter US wars and proxy wars elsewhere, including in Syria, where the US was able to successfully overthrow the government late last year, or Iran, which the US and its Middle Eastern proxies, particularly Israel, seeking to weaken its disruptive energies before turning to another being China and the Asia-Pacific region. So you can see division of labor and strategic sequencing in practice. They wrote these in policy papers before President Trump even stepped foot into office. President Biden, throughout his administration, set the stage for all of this. And now it is being carried out. And now you hear Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth repeating almost verbatim these concepts written out in these policy papers. That's why the policy papers are so important to go through and to remind people of constantly. The US is using a division of labor both in the Middle East and the Asia-Pacific region as well. Not just in Europe, but they're doing it in these 2 other regions as well. Forcing proxies, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Japan, South Korea, the island province of Taiwan, and the Philippines to divert large amounts of public resources to likewise procure and produce weapons to augment US military power and industrial production. I always hear people who myopically focus on the conflict in the Middle East, seemingly oblivious to what the US is doing everywhere else in the world, and they believe that Israel somehow controls the United States, and that Israel is controlling the US to fight its wars across the region. But if you look at the most recent conflict, and as per US policy papers, the Brookings Institution Which Path to Persia paper from 2009, they talked about using Israel as a US proxy, not the other way around. And that is exactly how the conflict against Iran unfolded. The US used negotiations as cover to distance itself from an Israeli provocation. The US armed and enabled and backed completely and consistently all throughout the conflict, from the very beginning until the US itself dropped bombs on Iran. And it was Israel, not the United States, taking responsibility for starting the conflict and also absorbing all retaliation from it. Those missiles Iran fired in defense of itself landed in Israel, not in the United States. It did damage to Israeli cities and people, not American cities and people. And that, again, is the reason you have proxies. You get them to pay the cost for your policies. This system of client states, together with America's global spanning military infrastructure, global spanning Navy, and its extensive network of political interference, both enhancing existing client states and creating new ones, allows the US to geopolitically outmaneuver the emerging multipolar world order, despite the advantages nations like Russia and China possess in terms of economic strength and military industrial production. So yes, Russia and China can obviously produce many times more missiles, artillery rounds, rockets. They have more air defense. They have more weapons and better weapons than the US. It's true, but the US has a larger network of client states that it can use as proxies against both Russia and China and everyone in between. And it also has global spanning military infrastructure. So even though they have less resources to work with, they can maneuver around the world more easily against Russia and China along their own periphery than they themselves can even defend against. So this is an advantage the US has. You have to make a list, 2 columns, a list of US advantages and a list of Russian and Chinese advantages. It is not lopsided in one direction or the other. They have pros and cons that balance out, and that's what we see playing out. We see the US being overstretched. We see Russia and China in many ways being overstretched, but in different ways because of different strengths and weaknesses. That is the point of this article, is to go over the many ways the US is still dangerous despite not being able to crank out as much weapons and ammunition as, say, just Russia or just China, let alone both of them combined. The next section of the article is titled An Unsustainable but Still Dangerous Balancing Act. The strategies of division of labor and strategic sequencing employed by the US, while seemingly pragmatic, are ultimately attempts to manage an unsustainable equation. By outsourcing military burdens to client states and prioritizing adversaries one by one, Washington seeks to extend its reach without overextending its immediate resources. However, these tactics come at a significant cost, compelling US client states to divert critical public funds toward military expenditures, often at the expense of domestic needs and social welfare. This was what I was talking about earlier. Europe diverting public money away from their own actual interest to essentially American imperialism, and the European people suffering because of that. This coercive and ultimately unsustainable approach, exemplified by NATO's increased spending directives, drains the collective wealth of nations, a process already undermining social cohesion and economic stability across the collective West. We can see the effect this is already having on Western society, how unsustainable it is. And so this is another advantage that, say, Russia and China have. They have real economies driven by a real purpose, a purpose entwined with the actual population of these countries, whereas the US is using its economy to pursue power and profit around the globe at the expense of the actual people living in the collective West. Moreover, the inherent unpredictability of international relations means that a carefully planned sequence, while you're doing your strategic sequencing, can be easily disrupted by unforeseen events, potentially leaving the US and its client states vulnerable on multiple fronts. The margins for error continue to narrow, leaving less and less room for contingencies created both by chance and by counter strategies employed by nations like China, Russia, and Iran individually or working in cooperation. And we see them working more and more in cooperation with one another. While nations leading the creation of a multipolar world cannot and probably should not create an equal but opposing network of client states to disrupt Washington's division of labor and strategic sequencing, they could encourage better cooperation across the multipolar world to defend against US political interference, economic coercion, and military aggression. I talk about this constantly, the need for China and Russia, who have already secured their own respective information spaces, to help other nations and regions of the world secure their information space, to secure it against US interference, and America's ability to coerce and even politically capture a targeted nation. And if you prevent the US from doing that, you prevent its network of client states and its global reach that it uses to outmaneuver Russia and China geopolitically. You constrain that network, and then you could start pushing it back. But right now, at this moment, there still seems to be very little even awareness of US political interference around the world through the National Endowment for Democracy, through USAID. All of this consolidated and streamlined under the State Department, still very much in existence and still operating effectively, still undermining peace, stability, and prosperity across the multipolar world. Not only would greater cooperation negate the advantages the US uses to offset the limits of its own military-industrial production, it could also disrupt the careful balancing act the US is performing to cling to its unipolar world order. So I often remind people and warn people that Russia is a bit overextended. There are things China probably would like to do, but simply cannot do because it's not all powerful. And the same goes for Iran. But the United States also has its limits. I don't just talk about the limits of one or the other. I'm trying to tell you there are limits on both sides, and there's a very dangerous balancing act being performed on all sides of this conflict. While multipolarism to many seems inevitable, it would be reckless to indulge in complacency. The collapse of Syria in late 2024, or the US-Israeli war of aggression against Iran in June of this year, and the obedience US client states across Europe, the Middle East, and the Asia Pacific still demonstrate in pursuit of US geopolitical objectives is a sobering reminder that despite what appears to be its irreversible decline, the US remains a significant threat to global peace, stability, and prosperity. It is a threat that will remain until nations of the world create the conditions within which the US is left no choice but to cooperate with all other nations rather than to continue to impose itself upon all nations. When I talk about the United States in this manner, I'm not referring to the American people, because the American people are among the many people around the world paying the cost for American empire. It is the people on Wall Street and those who serve them in Washington who are benefiting from all of this, while absolutely everyone else, including the American people, pay for it, pay the price for it. So it's very important to keep all of that in mind. We are all tempted with the desire to do confirmation bias, where out of all available information, we just want to pick information that confirms our bias, things that we wish were true. But we have to look at all of the facts and figure out what is actually true. And what is actually true is often very unpleasant to accept. And it's very unpleasant to accept the possibility that the US is still a tremendous danger, and that the rise of multipolarism isn't necessarily inevitable, and it's something that we all have to work on and invest in every single day, make sacrifices for if we want to see it come into shape. It is not something that will just come into shape on its own because of the immense amount of power and momentum the US still has, specifically to prevent it from emerging. So we have to keep a very close eye on all of this. As I remind people often, do not look at any one of these conflicts in isolation. They are all interconnected. The US has a global objective of eliminating all peer and near-peer competitors. It's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. It's proxy war and now direct war with Iran and its allies in the Middle East. It's military buildup, encirclement, and attempted containment of China. It's all tied together to achieve this objective. And what happens in Iran affects Russia and China and everyone else in between. And the same goes for everything that happens in Russia and China. It'll affect absolutely everybody else, everywhere else. American success in any one place, like say in Syria, is a setback for absolutely everyone else across the multipolar world. So it might not be in a place you're familiar with or even think you care about, but what is happening in, say, Syria is a setback for all of us everywhere else. It emboldens the US and it endangers everyone else everywhere else. And success anywhere against US hegemony is success for us all everywhere. It hems it in, it sets it back, it buys more time for multipolarism's rise. So we have to keep a very close eye on all of this. I will continue to keep an eye on this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for all of the links that I mentioned in the article, including the article itself I wrote for New Eastern Outlook. I will also pin the link to that article in the comment section, at the top of the comment section. In the video description are also all of the places you can find and follow my work. I publish my videos on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Telegram, and I also post other information on all of these platforms on a fairly regular basis. In the video description are also ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them or block them. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out and supporting my work, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or you're just sending me news tips, kind comments, or you're just sharing my work with others. You have no resources to spare, you're just sharing my work with others. That is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.